Okay, I'm going to do that again.
You got it.
Sister Clare Josef-Maier.
I'm so glad that you guys were willing to have this little chat today around particularly gender justice. At the beginning of the month of May this year, Sister Clare wrote an article on a blog called Cafe that talked about gender justice. And so I would just like to have a conversation with the two of you about what is gender justice and why does it matter that the church cares about gender justice? And why is it important that Sister Clare, a deacon in the ELCA, is able to speak out in accompaniment of gender justice? So let's start with that. Sister Clare, tell us a little bit about this article that you wrote.
Since 2012, I've been serving on the ELCA National Task Force, who is working on a social statement on women and justice for the ELCA. And part of my contact from Elizabeth McBride from Bold Cafe was from that capacity, having been engaged in these conversations about gender and faith for 6-7 years, and wondering if I would write to that from a personal perspective. And so part of my motivation to share that story is that I have heard in many conversations about gender justice in the church a lot of the pain and the anxiety and our brokenness as an institution, all of which are really important to name. But thinking about those whose passion is gender justice, not also hearing affirmation and joy in God's vision and God's intention, and having that be a dominant part of the dialogue as well. Mm-hmm. And the fact when that is missing from the conversation, it makes it very difficult to invite people into a conversation that feels, just anxiety provoking and dark and difficult, when really that's not what gender justice is. What gender justice is a fulfillment of God's vision for humanity and everything that we're capable of expressing in who we are.
I think that when we do our best to be intentional and thoughtful around gender justice, I think that we're actually allowing us to see the fullest vision of any sort of kingdom that can possibly exist, right? Like, it means that we all get to show up in all of our greatness, and whatever that is for each of us, that is self-defined. And I think that's the piece that in my work with Reconciling Works that I experience a lot of hiccups, is where people want to be able to tell someone who they are rather than creating space for people to arrive as who they
are. Why is gender justice important to the church?
I think gender justice is important to the church for a lot of reasons, one of which is the church is one holding space for the story of the source of humanity and who we are and how we engage the world, why we're here. And a part of that story is our individual expression of self in the world. And so I really appreciate what Aubrey is saying about allowing space for God's vision to flow through that person and teach us something about what God's vision is through this person being one way that we learn about that. I think it also matters in the church because we have a considerable concern for the well-being of all through love and service to our neighbor. And we don't do that well when we're grounded in injustice in any form. Gender injustice is certainly one of those ways. And so when we are not creating space for the other, whether that's one of our current designations of being a man or a woman, or whether that's a more expansive gender identity or stepping away from gender identity altogether, we don't love and serve well when we don't seek understanding in the other, when we don't seek to know that I'm actually serving you for who you are, where you are. So I think the church has a lot of reason to care about gender justice so that we can live into our baptismal vocations to love and serve.
Aubrey, what ways do you think that the church might be able to help kind of lean into the future of how we speak about gender justice in the world, and particularly in the context of the United States?
I had a colleague of mine, Asher O'Callaghan, who works with ELM, Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries. He was talking about what it means for him to identify as a trans man. and, you know, getting questions of like, well, do you think God made you wrong? Right? And his response was so simple, but one of the most beautiful things I have ever heard, because he said, no. He said, I believe in a God that is always making things new, right? And I'm a new creation every day in God. And I was just like, what? Like, that just totally blew my mind, because I was like, duh, absolutely. And I think that when we try to, through our church and through our culture, tell someone that you get to be either A or B, right? And if you choose A, you have to act a certain way, you have to identify a certain way, you have to express yourself a certain way. Or if you choose B, you have to act and express yourself in certain ways. Like, right, we have cultural expectations of what it means to be gendered in our society, and especially in our church. I think what would happen if we actually liberated ourselves from those very binary ways of thinking about gender and allowed people to live freely and fluidly in the freedom of knowing that they get to be made new every day by this God that has the most wild and beautiful imagination, right? And so to say that God is limited to just A and B of gender, I think is one of the saddest mistruths that we as a church can continue to perpetuate. And I would hope that in some ways and shapes and forms that we are starting to break that habit.
Can I hear from both of you, maybe a couple of tangible ways you think that we can live out our lives as allies for those who are indifferent or who are not in the A and B categories of gender? How can we participate in appropriate partnership with people that need that kind of accompaniment?
I say, like, at Reconciling Works, one of the resources that we have it's our Lutheran Introduction Guide to our lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender neighbors. And I think that it really helps people to understand that there are different components of what makes us people, right? We have our sex, we have our gender identity, we have our gender expression, we have our sexual orientation. And so for folks whose gender identity and maybe even gender expression live somewhere in that beautiful space of not being defined as male or female, I think for us to be able to create ways where we trust that people know themselves well enough to identify for themselves without us having to project any of our own history, culture, misperceptions onto them, and to allow them to arrive as who they are. And I think the other thing that would be such a blessing and such a gift is if in our work of discernment and journey and wonder and learning is if we can give people an opportunity to arise as big as God has made them. I remember a friend of mine saying, Aubrey, God has made you for a reason to fill a specific space in the universe and in the world, right? So let's let people arrive in this rainbow of diversity that exists to fill this very specific need that we have for them as the church, right? And not expect them to shrink and become something else just to fit within a binary system.
Deacons in the church can be particularly called to show servant leadership in conversations around justice and injustice, and in this case, gender justice, because this is the demographic of ministry most commonly outside the congregation, out in the world. And part of our call in the church is to function in such a way that we equip and empower the membership of the body, whether they be lay or rostered, to live out love and service in the world. And that's not a fully unique part of what we do, but it is a very central part of what we're called to.
I am so glad that y'all are having this conversation, because I recently just had chatted with some women who are a generation or two older than I am. And it was so interesting because they were asking very specifically about Senator Al Franken being removed from office, or him removing himself from office, and asking like if I thought that was appropriate. And I was just like, well, you know what? Like, as women, we are trained not to trust our truths. And I think for the church to be having a conversation about how important it is to be creating space for people who identify as female, or folks who are gender nonconforming, gender non-binary, to be able to trust their truth, and for the church to actually hear it and believe it, Like, come on now, church, like this is what has to happen in order for us to be actually, you know, the hands of Christ in the world.